the stories we consume in written fiction and other media and other forms frequently contain what we call frames. A frame is where, in a narrative, another internal narrative is introduced by that narrative, and then our point of view shifts to that internal narrative, and we deal with that very directly. This is as opposed to, let's say, the play within the play in Hamlet, right? There's a play, the players are up on stage, and then they're going to introduce a play, and we see that play sitting inside of Hamlet. So that is not a frame because we're just watching theatrical players. What would make it a frame is if the outside shell fell away and we directly interacted with the theatrical players, and that became our new play on stage. And so an example of that is Into the Woods, where there is a frame, which is this narrator who is telling us a story about these characters, but then when the characters take the stage, they take the stage and they become the play. And so the frame is the announcer, I forget what the word is, the person who's talking about them, and then we switch to the characters as the characters take over the stage. So there are many examples of frames throughout literature. It's a common thing, and it's a thing that goes way back. I'm going to just give you a few examples so we get a sense about the frames, and then talk about it a little. So the first one I want to talk about is, here's my Riverside Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales. Very famous poem, narrative poem, goes way back, and the Canterbury Tales has a frame. So on the outside is Geoffrey Chaucer, and Geoffrey Chaucer is talking to us directly as Geoffrey Chaucer. He says, in April, when the weather gets nice, then a lot of people want to go on pilgrimages, and I went on a pilgrimage once, and a bunch of us went together, and to pass the time while we were walking, we told stories. This is the group of people who were there, and here are their stories. And then when we launch into their stories, we launch into the Knight's Tale, the Merchant's Tale, the Wife of Bath's Tale, and under those circumstances, now you go into the narrative of that person. So the frame is Chaucer telling the story of the pilgrimage, and inside the frame is a set of individual stories by the pilgrims who are telling their story that sits inside the larger frame. That's the basic frame structure. We see that structure a lot. So another good example of that is the very popular science fiction novel Hyperion, incredibly popular, by Dan Simmons, and Hyperion is just the Canterbury Tales retold. This is a science fiction retelling of the Canterbury Tales. A group of pilgrims are on this alien planet where there was this incredibly powerful and enigmatic alien race, and these people are going on a pilgrimage to this alien race, and I think they're explicitly referred to as pilgrims. Now, the twist that Dan Simmons gives us is that the way pilgrimages work to this alien race is one of the pilgrims is given their wildest dreams, and there appear to be no limits to the power of what can be done for them, and all of the other ones are killed. So this is the backstory and what they're going in. And as they are traveling, each pilgrim individually tells their story, their backstory of how they got here. So the frame is the pilgrims are in this place where life and you know your wildest dreams or your death is on the line, and they've got to get across adversity and things to get there. And while that's doing that, that's the frame. Then there are these individual, inside of the frame, these individual narratives, which are the backstory of each of these pilgrims and each of these characters, right? So there's a frame and then stories inside the frame. Frames don't always have to go back and out the way Hyperion does. So another good example of a frame is Freddy's book by John Gartner. And in Freddy's book, roughly maybe the first quarter of the book is the story of this person who meets this young man who suffers from gigantism. He's like 8 feet tall or something, named Freddy. And Freddy gives him a manuscript, which is about a giant. And the rest of the book is that manuscript. And then that's it. We never return to the outside frame. There's no, this is what I learned from it. This is what I think. I called Freddy and we got him a publisher. Like, none of that's there, right? You meet this character, you meet this author who's coming from a very unique perspective, and then you read that author's literary work, and then you're done. Nonetheless, that's a frame. We start on the frame, and then we go directly into the inner literary work. Now, another example that probably everybody here will be familiar with, and most of us will know, is The Princess Bride by Williams Goldman. And it was a book first, and then it was a film afterwards, and it was changed a lot to be a film. And in particular, Goldman, who wrote the screenplay for the film, radically simplified the frame. So this frame is much more complex and nuanced. It's a different premise. It's much more complex and nuanced, and there's just a lot more going on in the frame of The Princess Bride, the book. But let's talk about the movie, because it's easier to understand what we're talking about for today. So in the movie, we've got the simple frame on the outside. There's this grandfather, and there's the sick kid, and the grandfather's going to come, and he's going to read to his sick grandson, and he's got this book called The Princess Bride. And then we go into the story of The Princess Bride, and that takes over, right? So that's the frame, and then we're inside of the frame. We're in the framed narrative. And then the framed narrative runs, and then we go back out. We see the grandson and the son, and the grandfather and grandson. They interact a little. We go back into the frame narrative again, and then we come back out again, right? So that's a frame, and that's how the frame is structured in that case. Now, I said there's lots of frames, and there are lots of frames that predate postmodernism. Obviously, Chaucer predates postmodernism. I think hopefully we all know that. So why am I discussing frames in a postmodernist podcast? And the reason for that is because frames take on, I would say, new energy. They're used much more, they're more frequent, and postmodernists try to get more out of frames in postmodernism than we've seen before. So as with many things, there are a lot of the telltale signs, the hallmarks of postmodernism. You can frequently find examples that predate postmodernism. And you'll find a few examples, and there won't be that many, and they won't be common techniques, and they won't be really, there's nobody trying to exploit them or use them to the max or find new ways to use them. They just kind of show up where they're convenient and they work. That absolutely is the situation with frames. Lots of frames. Why does Chaucer have the frame? Because he wants to tell these individual stories and he wants to bind them together. And the frame does that, right? That's the kind of thing that you would see a frame used. When postmodernists get around, now they try to run with it. They try to do interesting things with the frame. Why do postmodernists like frames? There's a few things. First of all, it's just a frame adds structure. There's a common thread throughout postmodernism to use structure and use structure as much as we can, find different ways to use structure and build interesting structure into our works. And frames, by their nature, inherently are increasing the structure and the complexity of that story and how that story is structured. And that's something that's very appealing to the postmodern sensibilities. Frames also very much flock with metafiction. They do not require each other. You can make a frame that is not in any way metafictional. You also can have metafiction without a frame. However, there are lots of ways where frames and metafiction work together and can strengthen each other and can work toward the same goal. And so as people are creating metafiction, creating frames is one way to do it. And as people are making frames and you're trying to do interesting things with the frames, metafiction is one of the interesting things that comes up as obviously. And the last one is that a frame, again, inherently by its nature, really calls out and highlights the artificiality of the fictional narrative. So one of the things that we see in postmodernism in general is this acute awareness of the fact that this is an artifact. that this is not an actual real story of an actual real person who really existed. Rather, it is a manufactured story. Even if it's trying to tell a true story, the person that it's talking about is not the person in the book, right? And that artificial nature, or that artifactual nature, is highlighted very clearly when a frame is used. And that's also, again, ties in with a lot of what we see in postmodernism and a lot of what postmodernist authors are going for. So I'd say a good frame is doing more than just being a little structure that sits on the outside. A good frame is adding something to the work that you would not have had in its absence. So let's look at our original examples, okay? Chaucer, right? This is a good frame. Part of what we're getting in the Canterbury Tales is Chaucer, by saying who's telling the story. This story is told by the merchant. This story is told by the priest. This story is told by the soldier. When he does that, you can tie the story back to that person and their role in society who is telling the story, and you can compare the two. And this was Chaucer's opportunity for social commentary about his culture. The priest's tale is Chaucer's opportunity to say things about the priesthood. The wife of Bath's tale is Chaucer's opportunity to say something about liberated, empowered women. Right? And that comes because of the frame. Hyperion absolutely is required. It's this very high stakes situation, like people are going to die, right? And the world is going to change. And exactly why they care so much that they're prepared to risk their lives and undertake this is clarified in everybody's backstory. And so the frame is absolutely necessary. Without it, we don't have a book. Just as without those internal narratives, we don't have a book that's worth reading. So the frame is adding value beyond what you would have otherwise. Freddy's book could just be this sort of Middle Ages. John Gardner creates a book that feels like a Middle Ages kind of Norse Celtic saga, sort of a Beowulfy feeling thing. He could do that, right? And he could have published that, and that could have been it. But by giving us this narrative of the recovery of the manuscript and a peek into the author of this manuscript, and that tying directly into the story about somebody trying to hunt and kill a giant, then it gives the book a new twist and a new flavor, right? And there's more going on, and John Gardner has more opportunities for character and commentary and things like that because he provides that frame, and that frame has visibility on the author of it and what he's doing. And The Princess Bride, again, a lot going on in the book version, but even if we look at the movie version, the grandfather reading to the grandson, this story that's ultimately about true love. And what we get is it's a picture of the grandfather having true paternal love for his offspring, for the child of his child, right? And this line, the "as you wish" line that he says to Princess Buttercup, "as you wish," at the end of the movie, when the grandson says, "Can you come back and read to me tomorrow?" He says, "as you wish." So it ties directly back. Without the frame, we don't get that, right? That is an opportunity for the author to make a statement that is beyond just this internal kind of fairy story book and connect it to a broader thing with people. And so those are all examples, in those examples where those authors are using those frames to do something that the work wouldn't do in the absence of that frame. And so again, frames have been around for a long time, but what are postmodernists doing with it? Well, first of all, they're just doing more of them. You see it more often. It's a very common structure that you see a lot for the reasons I gave above. They're also using them in interesting ways that you wouldn't necessarily just see. Like as with anything that involves technique or structure, you get postmodernists who try to look for the tricks and the opportunities and the way to get more out of their work that they wouldn't otherwise because of the technique or the structure. And in the case of postmodernists, there's a bunch of things happen. So one is there's nested frames. Okay, I've got my frame story, and then inside I have that a narrative. Well, what if that narrative turns out to be a frame and there's something inside of that? And what if I do that again? And how many times can I do that? And kind of these babushka dolls that you get with nested stories are themselves a postmodern technique and a postmodern trope. And I'm going to save nested stories for a later episode because there's so much to tell about them. It would be too much to try to cover in the same one where we define frames. But nested frames is a big one. And we see lots of nested frames in postmodernism. A lot of interesting things get done with them. But also just interesting techniques. So other techniques that occur with frames are possible. We're going to return to this, and we're just going to look into some of the interesting techniques that people have. I already talked about this idea with Freddy's book of where we drop in and we never drop back out, right? And that's kind of a smart, considered postmodernist thinking about how they're going to use these frames to full advantage. And there's a lot more to be said on this. So I also will return to a topic in the future where we start looking at some of the interesting things that people do with frames. But we'll see them a lot. We'll reference them a lot. Certainly when we're talking about structure, certainly when we're talking about metafiction, but also just in general. So there you go. That is a frame.